All right. Thank you so much for coming out to the second installment of our new lecture series, Highlighting Hidden Stories, examining the relationship between the African continent and the Middle East. This lecture series looks to challenge the artificial boundary between these two regions and explore the lives, experiences, and role played by marginalized voices in Middle East history. Each lecture focuses on a different region of Africa and a different theme. Our first speaker today is Dr. Leila Pourtavaf, who is Assistant Professor in Global Public History at York University. Dr. Pourtavaf holds a PhD from the Department of History at the University of Toronto and was most recently a visiting assistant professor at NYU's Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies. Her research stands at the intersection of gender, modernity, and Middle Eastern history, with a focus on Qajar Iran. Her upcoming book project, The Cosmopolis Harem, looks at the social, cultural, and spatial dimensions of the women's quarter of Nasir ad-Din Shah's court in the second half of the 19th century. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Professor Pourtavaf.
Thank you, Zara, and thank you all the folks from NMCSU. It's nice to be back. As some of you know, I was a former student in NMC and spent a lot of time in that student union room. So it's nice to rejoin you all virtually. I'm also excited to be co-presenting with the panelists. Give me 1 second, I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay, so let me just readjust myself. All right. Sorry, just adjusting my screen. Okay, so I'm gonna start my presentation with this photograph. In this photograph, taken and captioned by Nasir ad-Din Shah, the Qajar monarch who ruled over Iran between 1848 and 1896, a large gathering of high-ranking court and harem servants fills the steps leading up to the ostentatious doorway of the Shah's bedchambers, his khabgah, located at the heart of his harem. The image, likely taken in 1887, at the dawn of the last decade of his rule, is of a small cross-section of the multiracial laboring class who lived and worked in the Shah's residence at Golestan Palace and who were a significant part of the larger Qajar family structure. The maintenance and day-to-day function of the Golestan court and harem relied on this complex labor force made up of men, women, eunuchs, and children, many of whom were brought in as slaves, linking the center of Qajar power in Tehran to geographies of Iran's slave trade in the northern and southern regions of the country. In other words, the demographic diversity visible here was in large part the result of a long-standing and multi-directional slave trade from neighboring regions of the dynasty and its porous imperial frontiers. These individuals are amongst the most liminal figures of the Qajar court, slave servants who occupied central positions in the Shah's harem and were able to move between the gender-segregated interior and exterior sections of the palace with access to its deeply private realms, as well as highest-ranked administrative offices. They were often in charge of granting or refusing access to others who moved between these two realms. The setting on the steps of this most exclusive building within the harem of the Golestan Palace, the Shah's bedchamber, affirms their position as both servant custodians and intermediaries. At the front and center of this composition sits a young Malijak, so that's this little guy here, the nephew of one of the Shah's favorite concubines or sires or temporary wives, those words can get used interchangeably here, Amina Aghdas, who herself entered Golestan as a young slave girl from Kurdistan in 1859, and by the time of this photo had risen to great prominence in Nasir ad-Din Shah's harem. Her nephew Malijak, the son of one of the Shah's footmen, Amin Aghas's brother, is seated in the front row and nestled between the legs of an African eunuch. In Qajar historiography, Malijak is well known as the object of an unusual infatuation by Nasir ad-Din Shah and a figure who rose to become a powerful courtier in the last decade of his reign. In fact, he grows to marry one of the Shah's daughters, which is kind of a sign of his prestige. The central position he occupies in this image, surrounded by high-ranking servants of the court attests to the significant status in the Shah's harem his significant status in the Shah's harem from an early age. Yet, as the nephew of a woman who was bought for 6 tomans only 2 decades earlier and brought into the harem as an enslaved servant, his presence also challenges our understanding of the nature and social reality of slavery as it was practiced in Iran during this period. Today's presentation is part of a larger project that I'm working on that examines the institution of slavery in 19th century Iran and the ways in which hierarchies of race, gender, and labor function within the institution. In my larger project, I examined the complex and diverse history of migration and slavery to and within the region through the study of a specific, albeit very elite site, occupied by a variety of enslaved and formerly enslaved constituents, the site, of course, being the late Qajar court and harem. The goal of this project is to offer a challenge to the prevailing discourses about slavery in 19th century Qajar Iran. And I argue there are primarily 2 established narratives that I'm kind of working in between. The first attempts to posit slavery in Iran and the broader Islamic world as incommensurable to the Atlantic slave trade and its atrocious and racist legacies. Within this line of argument, the racial diversity of enslaved populations in Iran, the superior status of slaves within Islamic law, and the range of elite social positions that were afforded to some enslaved and formerly enslaved people in the region mark the institution as more benign compared to its Atlantic counterpart. Within this body of literature, the power relations and racial hierarchies endemic to the institution of slavery tend to get ignored, and at their worst, such narratives are steeped in a nostalgia about slaves as cherished servants who enjoyed a good life and were a part of the family. Much of this body of work, intentionally or not, makes a claim to Muslim benevolence as the cause of the less harsh conditions faced by enslaved populations in the region. Another limitation of this historiography has been that up until very recently, the racial implications of the institution are often obscured or denied. Behnaz Mirzai, who's authored the only published monograph on the subject, A History of Slavery and Emancipation in Iran, has argued that, and I quote, Iranian society was not preoccupied with racial divisions, and that the racial analysis of institution of slavery from this period applies only applies in European accounts and is overwhelmingly motivated by Europeans' authors' own idiosyncratic tendencies to dwell on racial considerations, end quote. More recently, over the last few decades, and in part motivated by discourses that have demanded the recognition of the prevalence and ubiquity of anti-Black racism within much of the Middle East, a host of scholars have turned their attention to the legacy of slavery in the region, in part as a way to historicize race thinking and racist practices that have thus far been understudied and under-theorized in Iranian studies. While this is a welcome move in a field which has often ignored the legacy of racism, and in particular anti-Black racism within the region, it also risks applying ahistorical and universal assumptions based on presentist concerns on the history of a deeply complex institution. A limitation within this body of literature is its reliance on theories developed from the history of the Atlantic slave trade and its clear racial legacies, which offer a paradigm that links slavery and anti-Blackness universally. As such, the focus falls almost exclusively on racially subjugated African enslaved populations in Iran, who are read as part of a trans-historical cultural phenomenon and thus posited as solely the victims of anti-Black racist ideology and afforded little to no agency. Within this body of literature, the overwhelming presence of white slaves during the same period is also largely ignored or under-theorized. So the goal of my larger project is to work between these 2 positions and offer a historical account of slavery in Iran in the 19th century that recognizes its racist, gendered, and class implication while historicizing the institution within its geopolitical specificity and examining the vulnerabilities and potentialities possible within this category. I hope to pivot away from arguments about the better condition of slavery in the Islamic world and the benevolence of Islam and Muslims in regard to enslaved laboring bodies, and instead examine how specific enslaved people within this region were able to understand and position themselves in ways that allowed for better life chances in the face of the degrading status that was forced upon them. So I'm going to start with just a brief description of kind of the historical account of modern slavery in Iran, so we kind of understand how these people landed here, and then I'll get back to the harem. So from the early Islamic period until late into the 18th century, slave populations in the region were primarily made up of non-Muslims who were part of the conquered territories. So Islam prohibits the enslavement of Muslims, but non-Muslims captured during war can be taken as slaves. As such, until the 19th century, the majority of enslaved people in the region were primarily from Central Asia and the steppes of Eastern Europe, captured as war booty and brought to work as military and government officers, as well as domestic laborers, eunuchs, and concubines in elite households. I'll just put up a map so you guys have a geographical sense. So we're talking about primarily within this region, which at various points between the Safavid and Qajars is controlled by Iran or Russian Empire. It's important to note that though war was the primary means of acquiring slaves from this region, and in fact, the acquisition of slaves was a major reason for many tribal wars that took place throughout the centuries between Kurds, Armenians, Georgians, Circassians, and other ethnic tribes surrounding the Caspian Sea and along the Silk Road. There was, in fact, an active and thriving slave trade industry centered on the northern shores of the Black Sea and spread throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. So counter to Islamic principles, these enslaved populations were in fact bought, sold, and resold regularly and frequently. In the historiography, these slaves populations are often grouped together as white slaves, though as I mentioned, they come from various rivaling ethnic tribes in the region. By the 19th century, the Russian Empire's expansion and conquests of the northern regions of Iran, along with Russia's aggressive abolitionist project, functioned to limit and eventually cut off access to these slave markets and diminish the number of white slaves, and I put white in quotes, white enslaved populations from these regions. Those smaller scale sales continued well into the 19th century. During the same period, Iran increasingly relied on the African slave trade of the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf. This trade had also existed since the early Islamic period, supplying part of the Ottoman Empire and the Arabian Peninsula primarily with enslaved East Africans, But by the 18th century, had grown to a thriving market economy in the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf region, which faced Iran's southern border, with Muscat having a virtual monopoly over the trade. So Muscat is somewhere around here in Oman. Throughout the 19th century, an increased number of enslaved Africans entered Iran, at first primarily through the port of Bushehr, and later through a number of other port cities in the south. So Lange, Bandar Abbas. Let me just go back to the map of Iran so again you get a sense. So Bushehr is here, and that's the primary port in the first phase, but Bandar Abbas and Lange and kind of other parts of the Persian territories to the south there become central to the Gulf slave trade. Okay, sorry, lost my stuff. Yeah, this was at the height of the Great Games, a rivalry between British and Russian Empire over control of Central Asia and Qajar Iran that lasted pretty much the entirety of the 19th century. Historians usually date it as 1813 to 1907. And the simultaneous project of European imperialism and abolitionism intersected in both northern and southern parts of the Qajar territories, as well as the Ottoman Empire and the Gulf states. Sorry, 1 second, I think I lost my spot. Perhaps not surprisingly, given the spheres of influence during the Great Games, while the Russian Empire focused on abolition in the northern regions of the Qajar Empire, the supposed white slave trade, British abolitionist efforts were focused on the Gulf and Indian Ocean regions, with little, if any, attention given to the Caucasian slave trade, in spite of its larger volume and more ancient roots. While there are many records of the intense level of debates generated in the British Parliament in relation to the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the Indian Ocean and Gulf markets, the trade within Central Asia and Caucasus was largely ignored despite the regular mention of and fascination with white slaves within European travel accounts of the region. And interesting, within British parliamentary records, they show that in fact British were very critical of Russian abolitionism efforts in this region and viewed Russian abolitionism as synonymous with Russian imperialism in the northern region of the Qajar territories, while they themselves were participating in abolitionist projects to the southern regions. In the second half of the 19th century, at the height of the British abolitionist project, and much to their dismay, the Qajar dynasty was expanding its trade of enslaved Africans. In fact, the African slave trade was emerging as a booming economy in parts of southern Iran as increasing numbers of enslaved Africans entered Iran from various land and sea routes. For example, after Muscat signed the 1848 anti-slave trafficking treaty with the British, marking an end to the thriving slave economy there, another port city, this time in southern Iran, Lange, emerged as a prominent slave market in the region, directly trafficking slaves primarily from Zanzibar. The large number of enslaved Africans who were sold in Lange were then transported to other Gulf regions such as Bushehr, Bahrain, and Kuwait, or smuggled inland to cities like Basra, and from there transported to other parts of both the Ottoman Empire and the Gulf states. During this period, the slave trade contributed in no small part to Lange becoming one of the most economically prosperous port cities in the Gulf. Many of the approximately 5,000 merchant families who resided in the port city were slave-owning families who participated directly in the slave economy. I mentioned this because there's a great need for a deeper study of the political economy of slavery in Iran during this period, and that's not my work, but it relates. This was during the brief few decades after British had signed abolition treaties with Muscat and various other sheikhs within the Gulf states and Ottoman government, but before the Qajar government had formalized similar treaties with Iran, leaving Iran as the only country which was able to effectively avoid British slave patrol ships in the region. And there's a whole economy that emerges in that region of Iranians renting their ships renting ships to other regional stakeholders to import slaves, because if they had Iranian ships, then they couldn't be patrolled. So I just wanted you guys to kind of get a sense of how deeply implicated Iran is in these slave trades and how abolition kind of shifts the demographics. We're going to jump back into the harem now. Okay, so within Golestan harem, the laboring class of the Qajar harem during this period, so we're talking about the second half of the 19th century, included Caucasian and Kurdish people from Georgia, Armenia, Circassia, and the various Kurdish tribal regions who had entered Iran from the northwest, a smaller number of Turkic people from North and Northeast Central Asia, as well as East Africans who originated from places like Ethiopia, Nubia, Tanzania, and Zanzibar, and entered from the south. And just so you get a sense, the court and harem was occupied from anywhere between 800 and 2,000 people. So the population, we're talking about quite a large grouping of people here. Golestan Palace was perhaps the only domestic space within 19th century Iran inhabited by all of the above categories of enslaved and formerly enslaved populations. The race of enslaved populations did in fact play a central role in determining their social positioning within the court and harem. For example, racial features and associated cultural traits, particularly among enslaved women, favored Circassian and Georgian slaves who were often brought in as servants, but could easily become high-ranking concubines and significant wives, a position that was rarely afforded to their Black female counterparts. Black female slaves primarily took on various forms of domestic labor, such as being wet nurses and nannies. While white enslaved women, and again, white is all of those categories that I talked about, and eunuchs, and this does apply to eunuchs as well as women, were often prized for their beauty and fair skin. African slaves were identified through their dark skin color, often in derogatory terms, but prized for their loyalty and child-rearing abilities, though they were almost never incorporated into the Qajar kin structure as anything other than slaves and servants. Having said that, the culture of servitude in the elite space of the Qajar Harem meant that the various classes of servants and members of the royal family shared what Stoller and Strassler have termed the emotional economy of the everyday. The various spaces, times, and people within daily life with whom sentiment was displayed, shared, withheld, and demanded. They argue that the everyday domestic life affected sensibilities and sentiments between and amongst various classes of people who shared relations of proximity. And as such, servants who occupied such spaces could leverage this differing relations of proximity to gain intimate knowledge of the private affairs of their masters and mistresses, and use them to further their status and place within the harem hierarchy. While such relationships were defined by deeply uneven structures of social status, race, class, entitlement, and obligation, there's ample evidence in the sources to suggest that servants used their close bonds with their royal masters and mistresses to gain access to wealth and privilege. Okay, so I'm gonna end with a case study. So I'm gonna end with the story of Agha Bahram, an African eunuch in Nasir ad-Din Shah's harem, who provides us with a good case study of how one enslaved African navigated his position to gain access to power, further his status, and protect his personal interests. It's kind of an attempt at pulling out the story of enslaved figures from the archive. So in the larger project, I respond to the limits I posed at the beginning in the historiography of slavery in Iran by centering slave narratives within the archives. And what I'm finding in my research as I'm currently conducting it is there are in fact a lot of sites where you can take slave narratives. So kind of read around a figure and find many sources that kind of situate them and give us access to their stories. Okay, so let's see what I have about Agha Bahram. So Agha Bahram was the chief eunuch of one of the Shah's favorite wives, who we've met already, Amina Abbas, the slave that was purchased for 6 toman and became a favorite wife in the last decade of Nasir ad-Din Shah's reign. So in this image, so this is a group of servants in front of the kitchen. Amina Abbas is this woman here, her nephew, who we also met, Mali Jack, is standing in the front, and Agha Bahram is behind, right there. Okay. So the Shah's favorite pageboy, Mali Jack, the nephew of Amina Abbas, offers the following description of Agha Bahram in his diaries. Quote, this is a long quote. Agha Bahram was one of the clever and intelligent eunuchs of the court. He was thin and black with sunken cheeks and a wide nose, and he was unparalleled in his pride and arrogance. When he entered the Shah's harem, he first stayed with Johar al-Ghabashi, but the Shah kept him for a period of time as part of the harem eunuchs. But when Amina Abbas rose in rank, she requested him from the Shah and he became her personal eunuch. When she gained more power in the harem, he was named her chief eunuch and took charge of all her affairs. He was trusted, loyal, and lived a respectable life, end quote. And this is a portrait of Bahram, sorry. The emphasis on loyalty was a common feature of descriptive accounts of enslaved Africans, and particularly enslaved African eunuchs in the Golestan residence. The belief stemmed from the idea that since eunuchs were slaves who were purchased at a young age, stripped from all family ties and cultural allegiances through having been removed from their bloodlines, raised and trained in the harem, in this case by another eunuch that's mentioned, Al-Ghabashi, and castrated, thus prohibited in their reproductive potential, they had no choice but to form intimate bonds with their masters and mistresses. Their trusted attachment to the Qajar ruling class was believed to ensure their loyalty. It was key to their high status within the court and harem, where they were charged with the most important and sensitive affairs and had many opportunities for promotion. However, such attachments also meant that eunuchs, as trusted confidants, had intimate knowledge of their masters, which they could and did deploy in various ways to promote their own interests, needs, and status. While the quote from Ali Jack emphasizes the loyalty and respectability of Agha Bahram and Amina Abbas's trust in him, sources from the period also reveal him as smart and calculating, In order to heighten his influence over Amina Abbas, for example, Agha Bahram is credited with causing a rift between her and her brother, Agha Mirza Muhammad, Ali Jack's father, in fact, convincing her to dismiss him as her husband, as her trusted confidant, and confiscate all his belongings. Mali Jack argues that because Amin Abbas herself, a former slave, was uneducated, she both trusted and depended on Agha Bahram completely and was susceptible to his manipulations. Because African eunuchs were often in charge of the education of royal descendants, many were themselves well-educated in the court when they were young children. In fact, throughout the 19th century, the education of most royal descendants, including Nasir ad-Din Shah and his heir Muzaffar ad-Din Shah, were primarily at the hands of various African eunuchs. Agha Bahram's power and influence also extended beyond Amin Abbas. He's said to have wielded power and influence over Nasir ad-Din Shah himself, which he used to convince him to appoint his allies to high positions of power in the Qajar bureaucracy. So the court chronicler Etemad Saltaneh, who has a kind of private diary of his daily affairs in the court over the course of many years of Nasir ad-Din Shah's reign, confirms this characterization of Agha Bahram. For example, on January 13th, 1883, Etemad Saltaneh writes, quote, Agha Bahram, the eunuch who has been working for Amin Abbas for a short time and who she has trusted completely, has suspiciously managed to accumulate 4,000 tomans of wealth. He was discharged and his account has been closed. However, only 2 days later, on January 15th, 1883, Etemad Saltaneh writes, I saw Agha Bahram again, who had been removed, back at the house. A group of ministers and royal descendants were summoned, and apparently they had to vouch for Agha Bahram. The Shah has accepted him back. Clearly, he held sway over these important figures, and they in return maintained this position of power within the harem, much to the dismay of Etemad Saltaneh. There are many paragraphs of Etemad Saltaneh kind of complaining about the position and status of Agha Bahram in his diaries. Agha Bahram lived a long and prosperous life in Tehran and was able to accumulate a significant level of wealth throughout his life. And he even was able to maintain it after Nasir ad-Din Shah's assassination and the disbanding of his harem. This was not the case for many of the Shah's wives and children, actually, at the time. In fact, toward the end of his life, Agha Bahram spent a large sum of money to build a school attached to a mosque in Tehran, which were named after him. The building, which still stands in the old part of the city in Paminar Grand Bazaar, just northeast of the gates of Golestan Palace, is a physical testimony to the life of this one enslaved African, who, despite his subjugated position, insisted on leaving a trace of his legacy at the heart of the old city. And it's not a coincidence that the legacy he left was a school. This goes back to this legacy of enslaved African eunuchs in the court being educators, and he's not the only person that leaves behind these kinds of things. So maybe during the discussion period, I can bring up a few other examples that I was going to talk about, but in the interest of time, I'll end soon. So high-ranking servants and slaves like Agha Bahram, who served in Nasir ad-Din Shah's court and harem, were rarely born into their rank. More often, they entered the court after being captured and sold into the Qajar slave trade. This process included being torn away from families, tribes, and indigenous cultures, enduring bondage, and in the case of eunuchs, bodily mutilation, often a long, harrowing journey during which they would most likely bear witness to many other enslaved individuals who perish along the route, a dehumanizing economy, and more. Furthermore, those who did work their way up the Qajar court and harem hierarchy rarely relied on the benevolence of their masters or on Islamic doctrine. Instead, they ascended through their own determination, ambition, and cunning negotiations. And still, regardless of their ascent, they too were a product of a cruel slave trade that cannot and must not be divorced from their historiography. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Pourtavaf, for that really, really fascinating lecture. I'll introduce our next speaker. Our second speaker today is Dr. Sumayya Kassamali, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Anthropology and the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. Dr. Kassamali's research addresses the transformation of gender, race, religion, and language in the context of transnational migration. Her current book project, Black Beirut, is an ethnography of African and Asian migrant labor in Beirut, Lebanon, and examines the experiences of primarily Ethiopian women who travel to Lebanon as domestic workers, only to flee conditions of abuse and enter the undocumented underground of the city. Without further ado, I will turn it over.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. Just 1 second. Okay, thank you, everyone. Thanks so much to Zara and the NMC Student Union, and of course to Leila and Marina, my colleagues and co-presenters. So the presentation is titled, "What is this Black in Black Beirut?" And it's a reference to an essay by Stuart Hall, which is called, "What is this Black in Black Popular Culture?" And yeah, with that, I will begin. So the theme for this lecture series by the NMC Student Union is highlighting hidden stories, examining the relationship between the African continent and the Middle East. Firstly, I want to commend the students for selecting this theme. As you know, the question of race and racialization is not only definitive of our current political moment, but has also seen a huge increase of attention in the field of Middle Eastern studies. A growing number of conferences, panels, and conversations have arisen around this issue in recent years, and we might say it's about time. It is certainly always a good time to question the regional and linguistic parochialism that frequently compartmentalizes Middle East studies into silos. The notion that Turkey and Iran are separate units from the so-called Arab world, or the push for subdisciplines based on the nation state, such as Lebanon studies or Syria studies, something I personally have deep hesitations around. However, conversations about how we define regional borders and the inadequacy of all available terms have been happening in the discipline for decades. In Dale Eichelman's 1981 text on the anthropology of the Middle East, for example, he notes that Mauritania was long considered to be part of the Maghreb by Arab geographers, but because it formed part of French colonial West Africa rather than North Africa, it is nearly universally dropped from current borders of the region. Afghanistan, on the other hand, tends to change regions depending on the war being fought. During the period of the Soviet invasion, it was frequently grouped together with Central Asia, whereas today, it is more likely to be connected to South Asia, or at least Pakistan. In fact, nearly every Middle East syllabus I have seen from multiple disciplines spends at least the first week deconstructing the regional category in the first place. So, what is at stake now in rethinking connections between the African continent and the Middle East? I want to spend my time today introducing you to a concept I have been working to develop in my own research on African and Asian migrant labor in Lebanon, what I call Black Beirut. There is, of course, a large body of scholarship on the question of Blackness in the histories of Islam, the Ottoman Empire, Indian Ocean trade, and the multiple other formations that link the modern Middle East to the African continent. This work importantly cautions us against treating Blackness as a historically stable entity that means the same thing across time and space. However, taking a cue from the framework of racial capitalism, we also know that the economic developments of the last century are inextricable from their reliance on racial logics and on hierarchies of human worth. I consider my own research an attempt to parse a form of racialization that has emerged out of the migrations, wars, and labor practices that have shaped contemporary Lebanon. While we know that social dynamics are never simply brand new, I want to make the case that Black Beirut is a phenomenon with its own relatively unique dynamics that emerge after the civil war in Lebanon, meaning as recently as the 1990s. As an anthropologist, I approach encounters between the African continent and the Middle East as opportunities for us to think analytically about diversity and difference, culture and politics, and relations of power in everyday life. After all, we do not live inside disciplinary or regional categories, but rather in social networks of hierarchy, intimacy, and exchange. So, as many of you will know, Lebanon is currently undergoing its most severe economic crisis since the Civil War. Decades of theft and greed on the part of the country's financial and political elite, as well as international actors, have led to the currency losing 80% of its value. Approximately half of the population is estimated to be facing poverty. The crisis has also drawn attention to the plight of the country's many African and Asian migrant domestic workers, who numbered upwards of 300,000 prior to 2019. This in a country of only 4 million citizens. Often a quick expense to do away with, as families' purchasing power has radically declined, domestic workers have been kicked out of homes where they have worked for years and left on the streets to fend for themselves, many without the wages they were due. In response, we have seen the most sustained political organizing among these communities and their allies in recent history. Week after week, dozens of women representing diverse countries of origin have rallied together to provide food, shelter, and medical assistance, as well as pressure their embassies to assist in repatriation. Over 1,000 women have been sent home thanks to these efforts. International news media has also paid enormous attention to this issue, as the unforgettable sights of Black and brown women camped out on the streets of Beirut in the aftermath of an explosion, a financial collapse, and a global pandemic has resonated with the ongoing strength of the global movement for Black lives. We might think of these scenes as one introduction to the immense precarity, vulnerability, and segregation that characterizes what I call Black Beirut. But this is not its only image. I conducted my research in Beirut from 2014 to 2016, amidst another one of Lebanon's seemingly endless crises, this time that involving Syrian refugees. Over 1 million Syrian refugees entered Lebanon after the intensification of the war in neighboring Syria, making Lebanon the country with the highest citizen-to-refugee ratio in the world at that time. Let's not forget that Lebanon is also home to hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees, largely abandoned by the state inside designated refugee camps administered with the assistance of the United Nations. By the time I arrived and slowly began to learn more about the city once glamorized as the Paris of the Middle East, a particular intersection of life had emerged from the ravages of globalization, transnational migrant labor, and war. Women, who we might refer to as African and Asian migrant domestic workers, had started dating men who we might refer to as Syrian refugees. Together with various Lebanese, Sudanese, Egyptian, Iraqi, and other mostly male characters, I learned that these groups inhabited an alternate Beirut, one with its own geography. It was composed of a set of spaces that were not entirely secret, but that I began to think of as an urban underground, a kind of layer to the city that was grittier but less formal, more suspicious of strangers but less judgmental, and more affordable but less secure than the other Beirut, the one with its endless skyscrapers and designer fashion boutiques. This was a city where Bangladeshi grocery stores opened in a Palestinian refugee camp, Sudanese men danced to Rihanna in underground basements converted into nightclubs, Filipino women invited Syrian construction workers to join them for karaoke at the back of hair salons, and Ethiopian women held a highly popular annual beauty pageant. There were catering services for home-cooked cuisine, cricket games in church parking lots, weekend schools for children who needed to be taught the right language or religion, as well as ways to smuggle sewing needles and hair extensions into prison. I came to refer to it as Black Beirut. My use of Black here emerges from three things, and I apologize in advance so that I will be unable to give any of them their full due in the time that we have here. The first is understanding the system of migrant labor in Lebanon and much of the region, known as the kafala system, as a system of racialization. The second is what we might refer to as the conditions of possibility of Black Beirut, namely that of escaping abuse and incarceration inside the domestic sphere. And the third is the way that racial binaries permeate everyday life in the spaces that I have described to you. My understanding further relies on multiple bodies of scholarship to which I am extremely indebted and which I will also mention briefly. So to begin, the kafala system. As many of you will know, migrant workers in most of the Arabic-speaking countries surrounding the Persian Gulf, as well as Jordan and Lebanon, are subject to a set of temporary foreign labor regulations referred to as kafala. The word kafala in this context is almost universally translated as sponsorship, referencing the fact that a citizen sponsor or proxy, like a small business, assumes legal responsibility over the sponsored migrant worker within the jurisdiction of a given country. But in my work, I argue that sponsorship is a highly inadequate translation, and the kafala system is better understood as a wide-ranging social institution that shapes both public and private life. When it comes to migrant domestic labor in Lebanon, the example of kafala that I focus on, it is neither a relation of sponsorship, nor, I would argue, one of employment, but rather a system of racialized servitude. Let me first contextualize this historically. Upper-class households in the areas that make up present-day Lebanon have long relied on outside help to perform domestic labor. Leaving aside domestic slavery under the Ottoman Empire, well into the 20th century, domestic service was arranged through local relations between well-off families and the poorer members of local villages, including those from what is today Syria. Elizabeth Thompson notes that in 1922, over 22,000 peasant women were recorded working as domestic help in the region, and families whose income had collapsed due to the decline of the silk industry sent their daughters to work in the homes of the wealthy in Damascus and Beirut. Wages were usually given directly to the father, but in many arrangements, compensation took the form of the girls being educated and socialized into the gendered practices of the elite, often increasing their chance at upward mobility through marriage. In the years after Lebanese independence in 1943, these young women were joined by Palestinians, Egyptians, and others fleeing regional turmoil for the economic haven that was supposed to be Lebanon. As late as the 1960s, Leila Fawaz records a woman saying that Druze and Christian women in Lebanon would refuse to work in factories or hospitals in Beirut, leaving such unrespectable jobs for the Kurds and the Shia, and preferring the socially acceptable status of working in the homes of wealthy Christian families. It was during the Lebanese Civil War that the demographic composition of these arrangements began to change. Egyptian, Palestinian, Syrian, and other workers either fled the country or were expelled from various regions due to their affiliations with factions implicated in the war, while approximately 40% of the Lebanese population also left the country at this time. At the same time, global economic crises in the 1970s led to a number of Asian countries, particularly the Philippines and Sri Lanka, introducing policies aimed at exporting their female labor force in order to reduce unemployment and increase national remittances. And the post-1973 oil boom in the Gulf region made it an attractive source of migrant labor from both Lebanon as well as South and Southeast Asia. So one of the stories about the origin of kafala in Lebanon directly ties it to what happened in Saudi Arabia and the kind of post-war connections between Saudi money and the Lebanese economy. So the confluence of these many factors provided the backdrop for the shift in Lebanon's domestic service sector towards African and Asian women. Although many started entering the countries in the 1980s amidst the ongoing civil war, the system only expanded into a wide-scale social phenomenon after the end of the war in the early 1990s, as money for reconstruction started flowing into the country. It was the 1990s that laid the foundation for Lebanon's recent economic collapse, as the post-war economy was reoriented around the service sector, and reconstruction took the form of privatization, massive public debt, and luxury real estate, a classic case of what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism. A key intervention of my research is to place the kafala system at the center of the story of post-war neoliberalism, which, although there's a lot of work on post-war neoliberalism in Lebanon, no one has mentioned kafala. As Lebanon became enmeshed in global circuits of financialization, and the peg of the Lebanese lira to the US dollar, which has now been lifted, enabled a higher standard of living in Lebanon than in many of its neighboring Arab countries, having a domestic worker became a minimum status requirement of belonging to the middle class, which leads us to where we were before 2019, an astonishing 1 in 4 Lebanese families employing a full-time live-in migrant domestic worker, with the number even higher if you consider part-time and undocumented labor. At the same time, policies surrounding employment in Lebanon, combined with global inequalities, have ensured that the only South or Southeast Asian, East or West African subjects you will encounter in Lebanon are migrant workers. The kafala system has therefore produced a near perfect synonymity between the category of racialized woman and the category of domestic servant. Research on migrant domestic labor around the world has long emphasized its place in what feminists have called the international racial division of reproductive labor, in which racialized women from the global South leave their own families behind in order to care for the families of a mostly northern female elite. Lebanon, as well as Singapore, Hong Kong, Saudi Arabia, and many other contexts, remind us that racial hierarchies are not limited to north-south divides. However, a peculiar paradox characterizes the particular story of Asian and African women in Lebanon. They were perceived as more trustworthy than the women that came before them due to their status as total outsiders. What this suggests is that they entered a country recovering from civil war, already marked as the ultimate foreigners. Over time, as they came to serve as status symbols of an emergent Lebanese middle class, a set of formal and informal practices consolidated around both their exploitation and their misrepresentation. In 2017, it was reported that 2 domestic workers were dying every week in Lebanon as a result of either suicide, failed attempt at escape, or murder. The unprecedented nature and quantity of these deaths is, I think, reason enough to believe that the kafala system has introduced a form of racialized subjection, or what Cedric Robinson refers to as hierarchies of human worth, that is unprecedented in the history of the Lebanese domestic sphere. It is this process that I gesture to with the term Black Beirut. The world of Black Beirut that I described to you, however, is not the same as the kafala system. Rather, we might think of it as its urban afterlife. It is a city made possible by flight, and this is the second context in which I conceptualize it in relation to Blackness. Over the last decade, increasing numbers of women who arrived to the country as migrant workers have escaped the homes of their employers and joined the undocumented workforce of the Lebanese capital. There, as I mentioned, they have also been joined by thousands of Syrian men, who themselves arrived escaping a different set of 21st century violences. Here, I am inspired specifically by the work of Fred Moten, both his concept of the undercommons and of fugitivity. For Moten and his collaborator Stefano Harney, inspired by the communities founded by escaped slaves in antebellum southern United States, The undercommons is a space forged in flight. It is one that cuts through neoliberal configurations of contractualized exchange in order to offer fugitive solidarities, rife with antagonism, yet generative of new social arrangements. Similarly, the inhabitants of Black Beirut live neither within frameworks of national identity or citizenship, nor those of transnational cosmopolitanism. Instead, a social world has emerged where those cast out of the commons meet anew inside of the city. Although I have also found the concept of exile productive here, and we might think of prior descriptions of Beirut by Mahmoud Darwish or Edward Said as a kind of city of exiles, the concept of exile does not adequately account for the fact that while there are other spaces for Syrians in the country, or Palestinians, of course, what I am calling Black Beirut was made possible specifically by the risks taken by migrant domestic workers. In fleeing a system of racialized servitude and incarceration that many themselves describe as modern slavery, and risking death or deportation to do so, few parallels seem more resonant than that of Marinage. So I want to pause here and reflect further on this conceptualization of Blackness. Famously, in the 1970s and 1980s Britain, political activists, artists, as well as cultural theorists, such as Stuart Hall, used the term Black to refer to all those communities who were racially excluded from hegemonic concepts of Britishness. The term Black, in this context, included those of both African and Asian origin. This was a classic case of what Gayatri Spivak referred to as strategic essentialism, wherein even those intellectually committed to the deconstruction of stable identities saw the need for certain generalizations as the grounds of common political action. But this usage also reflects more than just a temporary tactic for political unity. The works of Stuart Hall articulate an argument that has reoccurred throughout what is often referred to as the Black radical tradition. The notion that Blackness as signifier exceeds that which defines a group of people or an identity. Arthur Jaffa has called it the difference between the experience of Black people and the Black experience. Hortense Spillers has offered it as a way to rethink the patriarchal logic embedded in the family. And Fred Moten, as I mentioned, has theorized it as a form of insurgent fugitivity. To quote Stuart Hall, the moment the signifier Black is torn from its historical, cultural, and political embedding and lodged in a biologically constituted racial category, we fix that signifier outside of change, outside of representation, and outside of political intervention. It is my argument that the Black of Black Beirut allows us to understand both the histories of racial capitalism that define the kafala system, as well as the transformation of the city of Beirut by those who arrived to the country as its subjects. That said, a large body of scholarship has also cautioned against invisibilizing the specificities of the Black experience by subsuming diverse histories under the term. To clarify, my argument is not that the Filipina women singing karaoke in the alleyways of Beirut have been resignified as Black through the kafala system, but rather that the joint histories of racialization and flight that make this moment of karaoke possible can be illuminated for us by the concept of Black Beirut. But I also want to explain that Blackness is not simply a heuristic device here. It is also a social fact. The majority of domestic workers in Lebanon today are women from Ethiopia, with numbers from across the African continent steadily increasing in the years before the crisis. A report on contemporary efforts to assist repatriation lists groups of women from not only Ethiopia, but also Kenya, Cameroon, Gambia, the Ivory Coast, Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, and Madagascar. I mean, this diversity itself is just kind of incredible to reflect on. And while the first country of origin for migrant domestic workers was Sri Lanka back in the 1970s, In recent years, large numbers of Sri Lankan women, many of whom I met, have started returning home, having spent decades of their life in Lebanon and no longer able or willing to continue. In contrast, in 2017, Ethiopians made up over 2% of Lebanon's population, and the numbers we have are definitely deeply underestimated because they're based on state statistics, which have many holes. So 2% of Lebanon's population, even that number makes them second only to Armenians among the country's non-Arab communities. Armenians are around 4%. So apart from simple demographics, everyday migrant life in Beirut is also steeped with tropes of Blackness. On the one hand, the cultural references of the city that I'm describing are dominated by Black popular culture, ranging from Drake to Afro-European fashion trends, to nightclubs called things like the African Club or African United Club that feature a mixture of Afrobeats from Nigeria and popular hits from Ethiopia, alongside electronic remixes of the Arabic debke genre. On the other hand, popular insults that target migrant workers include Yil'an Launik, damn your color, Ya Cola, hey Coca-Cola, and Ya Fahme, hey piece of coal. It should therefore come as no surprise that dominant narratives about the differences between Lebanese citizens and foreign workers are full of references to the binary oppositions of Blackness and whiteness, as opposed to third-term equivalents such as brown. From popular television shows to coffee shop conversations, migrant domestic workers are regularly contrasted with their Lebanese employers through painfully familiar oppositions between ugly beautiful, stupid smart, dirty clean, immoral moral, and so on. One particularly notorious example of this involved a bizarre campaign launched by local feminist organization Kafa in 2016, who set up a mock product stand at a Beirut grocery store advertising a soap meant to clean domestic workers' bodies. The mock campaign, which was intended to raise public consciousness about the racist nature of these associations, was so successful that the Lebanese Ministry of Labor mistook it for real and called upon citizens not to buy the product. Here, this bar of soap does not simply represent an offensive assumption about domestic workers' alleged dirtiness, but it materializes the deep social structures of racialization that make it possible for Lebanese employers to locate extreme foreignness on the domestic worker's own body. This can also be found in a range of other individual and social practices, from the frequency with which domestic workers have their heads forcibly shaved by their employers, to the fact that most private beach resorts in Lebanon do not allow African or Asian women to enter the water unless they are fully clothed. To return to terminology, my use of Black here, again, is not a direct translation of a term used to describe this social world by Lebanese citizens or by migrant workers, what traditional anthropology would refer to as an emic category. But it remains that which feels truest to the many complexities that characterizes the places and the people that I encountered. Unfortunately, in-depth historical research on the production of Blackness in modern Lebanon remains to be done, although we have hints at multiple genealogies alongside that of post-war migrant labor. So for example, the Ottoman slave trade, the racist discourse surrounding Senegalese troops who were sent to Lebanon under the French colonial mandate, the fascist and white supremacist ideologies that crossed over from Germany and Italy into certain Lebanese political parties / militias, the connections to Saudi Arabian capital, specifically what Robert Vitalis has documented as the Jim Crow logics that influenced labor practices in the development of the Saudi oil industry, and the many instances of popular cultural consumption that have brought various racial representations from both within the region, so Egypt specifically, and abroad, specifically the US. And so, while I opened by locating my research in the story of post-war Lebanon, I want to conclude by acknowledging that any story about Beirut cannot be severed from longer histories, ones that caution against a straightforward account of Blackness in the Middle East. To conclude, then, let me introduce you to someone I met during my research. We'll call her Sophia. This is not Sophia, it's just an image from a photographer who did a series on African migrant labor in Lebanon. Sophia has been in Lebanon for over 55 years. When she was a young child in Brazil, 6 or 7 years old, orphaned without family to care for her, Sophia was adopted by a wealthy Lebanese family conducting business there at the time. Brazil continues to be home to millions of residents of Lebanese origin, and Sophia's adopted parents were part of a wave of migrants from Lebanon to South America, dating back to the late 19th century. In Sophia's case, the young couple, who at the time had no biological children of their own, decided to return to their village home in the mountains of Lebanon with a young Sophia. It was the early 1950s, and Lebanon was in the first decade of its independence, prosperous and promising. Back in Lebanon, the family thrived. They lived in a large villa and were reputed to be of significant means and local connections. Sophia began to grow in the company of first one and then a second sibling, whom she referred to respectively as her sister and brother. Her adopted parents, similarly, attained the status of mother and father for the young girl. For 2 years, Sophia went to school with her siblings, just like the rest of the children in the family. At the age of 8 or 9, however, she was pulled out of school to help out with some chores at home. Her younger sister continued to pursue an education, but Sophia was asked to help around the home with the cooking and cleaning. First, a few small chores, wash the laundry, sweep the balconies, and then with increasing responsibility. The years passed. Sophia grew older, as did those around her. Her adoptive parents aged, and her siblings got married and had children of their own. Sophia kept working. Eventually, the heads of the household died, and Sophia, now unquestionably transformed from daughter to maid, moved on to work in the house of the woman whom she still referred to as sister. Sophia has continued serving this Lebanese woman, whose biological claim to a family that began as shared gave her a future of marriage and reproduction that was foreclosed to her adopted sister. Sophia continues to work in the manner of a cherished domestic servant, passed on through generations of a family who are the only kin she has ever known. She is now 64 years old. For over 5 decades of exhausting labor, Sophia has never been paid a cent. At a certain point, approximately a decade ago, Sophia's sister/employer realized there might be something about their unorthodox family situation that could get them into trouble. The Lebanese woman went through backdoor channels to have a sponsorship contract drawn up and managed to renew Sophia's Brazilian passport, thereby ensuring all paperwork was in order. 2 years ago, a Christmas celebration was held at their home. An extended family member brought their young Ethiopian domestic worker to the celebration, and the woman struck up a conversation with Sophia. She was shocked as she began to understand the story. Aware of the services of the Migrant Community Center, or MCC, a Beirut space started to support migrant workers some years prior, the woman convinced the family to allow Sophia to accompany her to church on an upcoming Sunday. It was at MCC that I met her. Sophia spoke a gently awkward Arabic, like the language had never quite settled inside of her. She dressed in muted colors, oversized shirts and long skirts, with shortly cropped hair, a sharp jawline, and a smile that was all teeth. Over the next weeks, a lawyer sought out possible solutions to help her. Under the rules, she could not legally transfer her employer because of her age. No family will agree to sponsor a domestic worker over 60 when the kind of work required demands a younger body. And even if one were to try, the Lebanese state would never approve it. The Brazilian embassy offered to assist in her repatriation, but Sophia had nothing in Brazil, no family, no language, no social ties, and no meaningful recollections. Despite having lived in Lebanon virtually her entire life, she had no access to Lebanese citizenship. The flimsy piece of paper recording her adoption, one that Sophia remarkably still holds in her possession, was not issued by a governing authority and bears no legal weight in contemporary bureaucracy. As for Lebanon's old people's homes and monasteries, they would not take foreigners. What job could Sophia find at this age? Who would raise enough money to pay for the next years of her life? And so Sophia came to MCC whenever she could escape in order to attend French classes and meet other women, excited at the newfound company, and like so many who live on the margins of Beirut, waiting for the possibility of another chance. Unlike the Ethiopian women and Sudanese men who I met at MCC, who held strong narratives about being Black and facing Lebanese racism, I never heard Sophia mention her own Blackness. Sophia's story takes us back to the arrangements that preceded migrant domestic labor in Lebanon, the ones where young girls were sent to work in the homes of wealthy families, often in exchange for things other than wages. Sophia blurs the category of adoptee, domestic servant, and slave, and her story appears as if a remnant of this earlier history. Although most of the pre-war accounts I mentioned list Arab and Kurdish women in the roles of domestic worker, every so often I would encounter a young woman from the African continent, or in this case, the African diaspora, who surfaced at the edges of someone's memory. It never entirely clear how she ended up in Lebanon. Recently, a historian colleague sent me a short description of an orphan girl who was found by a British woman in the home of a Syrian Bedouin family in 1863. Lady Jane Digby, who had married a Bedouin sheikh in the 1850s, took the young girl, had her baptized as Leila because her dark skin resembled the night, and placed her inside a German orphanage in Beirut, where she was to be trained as a servant for a wealthy family. The echoes with Sophia's story 100 years later are not pure coincidence. Rather, they attest to the enormous amount of work that remains to be done on race in the Middle East, and its connections to the possibilities of a future for those like Sophia. A future and a present in which these are not questions of abstraction, nor of precision, but of how one might live.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Professor Kassamali. I'll go ahead and introduce our third speaker. Our third speaker today is Dr. Marina de Regt, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Cultural Anthropology and Development Sociology at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Her main research interests are gender, labor, and migration, in particular between Yemen and the Horn of Africa. She is the author of Pioneers or Pawns, Women Health Workers and the Politics of Development in Yemen, and co-edited the volume Migrant Domestic Workers in the Middle East, the Home and the World. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Reg.
Thank you, Zara, and thank you the previous two speakers who already, had very impressive talks and lots of food for thought. So I'm gonna, I think I have about 20 minutes. Huh? I will keep it to 20 minutes, so we need time for discussion, I think. I didn't write a paper, and I'm not gonna read a paper. So maybe it's because of my Dutch or European background. I just talk from the top of my head. And also I asked Zara yesterday, I'm not going to give a theoretically founded paper. I'm just going to talk about hidden stories in Yemen with a strong relation, of course, with Africa. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it? So I titled it Gender and Migration Between Yemen and Ethiopia. As Zara said, my PhD dissertation was about Yemen and not particularly about the relation between Yemen and Ethiopia. And I want to say where my interest came from. Let me see. Okay, if I click. Yes. Well, first a map, but just to show very few people, realize that Yemen is so close, geographically closely, located to the Horn of Africa and to Africa. In fact, the Bab el Mandab, which is the place between, well, the narrowest place between the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, is just like 20 kilometers. And there have been age-long, I mean, century-old relations between Yemen and the Horn, which is something we never, or we don't hear a lot about in Yemeni studies, as Sumayya also said. In Middle Eastern studies, Yemeni studies is very much focused on the tribal part of the country, and it is as if there have not been any connections with well, overseas areas, with the exception of Asia, because there are lots of Yemenis have traveled to Singapore and Indonesia, and the Hadrami diaspora is very well studied, but the links with Africa have been, yeah, surprisingly, yeah, received very little attention. When I went to Yemen, that was in 1991. In fact, I went as a development worker. I finished my master's in anthropology. This is me when I was a bit younger. And these were my colleagues in a development project in the highlands in Yemen. Well, this is a picture that really already shows the wide, say, diversity of people, of women, of dressing, because often Yemeni women are portrayed as very heavily veiled in black. These were my colleagues. The woman next to me was a Sudanese woman who also was an expert. The woman next to her is from Aden. The woman next to her with the darker skin is in fact of mixed descent. Her mother comes from Chad, while her father was Yemeni. Her father died. And I will talk about this link. I have to say, this surprised me, of course, in the beginning of my first years or months in Yemen. Like, wow, there are relations between Yemen and Chad. The woman next to her is from a category of people that are called Abid, which means slaves in Arabic, and which is a kind of lower status group. And they are considered to be descendants of slaves that came really like centuries ago, in the time that Yemen and Ethiopia were very close. But the real, the real origins of Abid and Aghdam, a second group that has an even lower status in Yemeni society, have never been really proven. Okay, I didn't study Abid and Aghdam. There are more studies being done about these groups nowadays, which is very good. It's very important. And also there are groups, NGOs now in Yemen that support, and also self-organizations of Abid and Aghdam that are trying to improve the position of these lower status categories. But of course, Yemen is now going through a horrible war. So also this affects race relations and gender relations in a very negative way. But I'm going to focus on the group of people that are, that have these connections with the Horn of Africa and that are a bit more recent. So in the 19th and 20th century, Yemen was an imamate and very isolated, and the imams that were ruling Yemen were really kind of intentionally keeping the population isolated and underdeveloped, and this led to a lot of male outmigration. Some of them came to Europe. They became they entered ships and migrated also to Egypt through the Suez Channel. But quite a number of men migrated to Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. These men often married with local women, and in the 1960s and got children, so children of mixed descent. And these men returned to Yemen after the downfall of the imamate in the 1960s. In 1962, the imamate was overthrown, and there was a 7-year-long civil war between Republicans and Royalists in Yemen. And there was a strong call to return home after, well, the imamate was overthrown. At the same time, there were in Ethiopia, but also in other African countries, nationalizations policies after independence. Countries started to, or governments started to really have quite, well, say pro-local population policies, and the Arabs that were living in those countries, and often merchants, were losing property and losing their kind of what is it, privileged positions. So many Yemenis returned home and brought, of course, their wives and children with them. These African women came to Yemen and came to a society that was racist. They didn't have any idea where they were migrating to, and their children of African Yemeni descent, in fact, started to, they had to fit in to Yemeni society and started to identify more and more as Yemenis and not as Mualadin or Mualadat, which are the terms used for people of mixed descent. And for example, my colleague whom I met in 1991, she was proud, but you could also see that she physically clearly identified as somebody who had African descent, but she would always say that her father was from one of the high status groups in Yemeni society. Yemeni is a very socially stratified society, and that therefore her social status was also high. But I and others, we also experienced that Mualadin and Mualadat were looked down upon and not seen as pure Yemenis. About the women, in fact, I've been always very interested in the mothers, in the African women that came to Yemen, and that nobody ever wrote about. So I've been writing a number of papers about it, but I also have not been able to do a lot of research, also because of the deteriorating political situation in Yemen. They followed their husbands, so they were dependents, low status in society because of their African descent. And the link with domestic labor is that these women were often forced to take up paid work because their husbands came back or returned to a society that was not offering them, was not offering them chances or the opportunities to provide for their families. So unemployment and difficulties to make ends meet, which made women take up paid labor, also as cleaners in hospitals and offices, and as live-out domestic workers, never as live-in, but as live-out domestic workers. But all these types of work were not, as Sumayya also referred to, were in her historical overview, was work that Yemeni women were not willing to do. If Yemeni women would do that, it would be seen as very derogatory. So it were women of African descent that were in fact often the first ones to take up paid labor. They stayed permanently, they became integrated in Yemeni society. And what you see is in fact that their children of mixed descent started to also be pioneers in with respect to paid work. So they were able to attend education. They often took up paid labor in, for example, nursing, teaching, healthcare work. So in my PhD dissertation, I did come across women of mixed descent who were the first health workers. But all these categories of work were very, all, in fact, every type of paid labor outside of the house was seen as, as low status. So the mothers and the children were also in a way pushing boundaries. I present them as pioneers, but this is of course in a society with very strong racist tendencies, in which also doing paid labor outside the house was very negatively perceived. Well, this is a picture of one of my best friends, Nama, and this is her grandchild. And Nama, she told me she was her mother was Eritrean and her dad a Yemeni, and she told me when I married, I wanted to marry a white man, and a white man was somebody from the mountains who was of tribal origin, who was considered a pure Yemeni. And she said, I want to have white children because I have suffered so much from being Black, and I don't want my children to go through the same. Well, her children, were lighter skinned than her, became full Yemenis. And you see, the stark contrast now with her grandchild, who is, is white, almost white. Whatever you can. I mean, I'm very interested in Sumayya's theoretical conceptualization of Black and white, and I think I could use that also in my analysis of how this works in Yemen. Race and skin color. Well, this is just me. I skip it. I go quick because I said I wouldn't talk too long. So how much longer do I have? Okay, 7 minutes. So in fact, this was never the focus of my research. My PhD was on labor and healthcare workers, but I came across women of mixed descent and I met their mothers, which really inspired me. And then in my postdoctoral research, I started studying domestic workers that were coming straight from Ethiopia and Eritrea to Yemen. And that is, in fact, comparable to Sumayya's research topic. And I was very interested that in a country like Yemen, a very poor country, the poorest country in the Middle East, there are even migrants going there to do domestic labor. So the main question would be, why on earth are people from poor countries going to a poor country where, and why do local women not do that type of work? Because there's a clear demand. So that Sumayya also answered that local women were not willing to do that type of work. But then also there were clearly women interested in coming to Yemen, and that is linked to this historical relationship, because the brokers in Yemen, the people and the employment agents that bring women, Ethiopian women to Yemen, are often those that are of mixed descent. So they have both say links in Yemen because of their Yemeni parentage or descent, and they know Ethiopian society because of it can be their mother side, but it can also go back a bit further. It's not, so they created this, you could say, supply. It's different from, very different from Lebanon is the fact that only upper class and say middle class families would employ live-in domestic workers from abroad. And that is maybe 5% of the population. So the large, and in urban areas, of course. So 75% of the population lives in the countryside. They would make use of domestic servants or labor, but only for particular tasks and not as live-in domestics. But it wasn't really an increasing phenomenon in the 1990s and 2000s. But racist attitudes were very strong, and that relates very much also to what Sumayya said. The Ethiopian and Eritrean Eritrean women really came temporarily, and they were often high or educated or just dropped out of school when they were 16 or 17, and they saw their stay in Yemen as temporarily. They wanted to return home, save money, like many migrants, but some of them stayed really much longer, 8, 10 years. Some became undocumented. Well, I wrote about that too, about also the large diversity between women. Another big group, but I'm not talking about this here, are Somali women. There are really many Somali refugees in Yemen. They came since 1990, and Somali women were also doing domestic labor, but interestingly, never as live-in, which was by Yemeni employers always explained with reference to the fact that they were not trustworthy. This is also a very interesting. Religion and say ethnicity were often used. Ethiopian Christian women were seen as more trustworthy than Somali Muslim women. So I also analyzed those preferences for particular types of workers in an article. Well, here, this is in fact, a kind of an typical image. You could see the heavily veiled Yemeni employer, and then the domestic worker, holding the kid in a park. This is another image on a Friday afternoon, Ethiopian women going to church. No official churches, not like Lebanon, but underground churches, often in buildings that just look like houses, villas, but tolerated. At the time that I did my research, it was tolerated by most Yemenis. Well, I want to go quickly now for 2 minutes, 2 minutes, to the situation after 2015. So as we all know, Yemen is now really going through a horrific war already for more than 5, almost 6 years. So what did this mean for migration? Well, domestic workers were very often dismissed in the beginning of the war. And also now a lot of women lost their jobs, also comparable to Lebanon. I think there are not, the numbers were of course lower than in Lebanon, and there were no issues with people being stuck in the country. I think it was already gradually getting less. So in 2013, I was in Yemen and I visited an agent, and he said, there is already less demand and we are not bringing as many women as we used to do. I have been following Ethiopian women that I knew, and they really clearly stated no way, we're going back home, and from Ethiopia we might migrate again, but then we go to Dubai, Emirates, Lebanon. Well, Lebanon was already, I think, seen, and there was a ban also from Ethiopia to Lebanon, but the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia were seen as much better alternatives. So, but that is the last point I want to make. What is very interesting, but also very shocking, is that migration between Yemen and Ethiopia has not decreased, because an increasing number of Ethiopian men are crossing the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden by boat, and they intend to travel on to Saudi Arabia. That goes into the hundreds and thousands. Often these men, they don't know that they have to travel through Yemen. They are convinced by brokers that they can easily go to Saudi Arabia where they can make money. Ethiopian women can go in a regular way to Saudi Arabia as domestics, while for Ethiopian men there's no regular migration. There's no formal employment. They often go to herd cattle or work in the fields or be guards, and that is irregular work. And so they take the chance and they travel by boat and have to cross the Red Sea or Gulf of Aden, and their terrible stories and reports, but also very, very little good data. A lot of abuse and exploitation, also torture camps, and there are also stories of women that, but very few that migrate in this way, and yeah, very few people, or I mean, there's very few research being done. Yemen is at the moment totally closed off. No journalists can go, no researchers, no foreigners, even local researchers or journalists are, yeah, I mean, arrested or, yeah, have left the country. So there's still a lot of like hidden stories that have to be, what is it? Opened and written about. And one of my ambitions is to write a book that really covers these gender dimensions from like late 19th century till now. But lack of data is something I struggle with. That was my input.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Direct, for that really brilliant talk. Thank you all so much for all of your insightful presentations. I will stop recording.